God chooses Abraham to be a major player. Well, excited about today. We're doing our number 2 study in eschatology, and if you haven't watched the first video in this series, go back and watch the first video where we give you a little bit of an introduction on what we're doing, studying the end times, what the term eschatology means, and just some of my background with it when I began to study it back in the late 1990s. But we're into number 2, and again, I really wrestled over this. I wanted to do this series because, one, there's just all kinds of stuff out there, and I think we can do a good job at just kind of giving you an overview of what do we mean when we talk about end times versus last days, kind of words and phrases like rapture and second coming and, the millennium and, all of those kinds of terms that are obviously biblical. But I don't think most people can take them and take those terms and phrases and put those in the scheme of, understanding prophecy, biblical prophecy, kind of putting it in the whole context of prophecy, which begins in Genesis. And so obviously we can't look at everything because, the whole story from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through, the last verse in Revelation chapter 22, it's a story of God redeeming mankind, reconciling mankind to himself. And so it's super important. I mean, there's more about Jesus' second coming than there is about his first coming. So, eschatology really matters. And I covered some of this in the first, video. You meet people say, "Oh, it all pan out and it doesn't matter." Well, it does matter. Like it really, really matters. Jesus criticized the leaders of Israel and the people in the first century, Jews in the first century, for not knowing the season in which they lived. And so it's just really important. So I want to cover some things. And again, got to pick and choose what we're going to look at, what we're going to study. So let's jump into it. Now, we looked in Genesis and there's a lot of things we can touch on. We looked in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 on the first video. And, some of this stuff we might come back and look at. We're definitely going to revisit some of the things we're going to talk about today when we get into Daniel. But we're going to skip through a large portion of, history, very important history, the Tower of Babel and the first major rebellion of mankind against God. That's a significant time. And there's a lot of the kind of Hebrew language and terminology and symbolism there that will be revisited in Revelation. Probably going to come back and glance at the Tower of Babel. Obviously, the whole time of Noah. And I really, how much we can't let this be a 30-week study. Just that won't work. And so we're skipping the flood and that day and season in which Jesus himself, mentions the days of Noah. We're going to cover some of that. So we're going to come back and gloss over some of these other significant events that we're skipping over now. But I wanted to jump right in with Abraham. And Abraham is a huge prophetic piece of Israel and Christian and Muslim and Palestinian history. He's just, there are 3 major people groups, 4 really, that come back to Abraham. And so we want to look at him and obviously Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is really significant themes, not only in the Old Testament, people, for the Old Testament, but people for, New Covenant believers as well. And so Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and Palestinians, which are they're Islam, they're Muslims as well, but they're just a little bit different. Those 4 people groups, I call them 4. Muslims, Palestinians, Jews, and Christians all trace their heritage, their lineage back to Abraham, like we all go back to Abraham. So this is a huge piece of world history. And so we want to cover this because the narrative surrounding Abraham's life and why he's so significant is God chooses Abraham to be a major player. And Abraham, accepts it and walks with God in this kind of wonderful faith relationship. It's really remarkable because it's before the law was given. So it's before all the don't do this and don't do that stuff. There was a righteousness that was available without the law, which is Paul's whole argument in Romans. But he walked before God and was blameless. He trusted God. He believed. And God really had this unique relationship with Abraham, and he becomes this huge piece in God's redemptive puzzle to redeem a world, redeem mankind back to himself. And so we're going to pick up a couple pieces of this. And the first part is in Genesis chapter 12. If you want to follow along, we're going to have some of these verses up on the screen. But in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, I don't know how much I'm going to read through all of this. You can go and read it. I'm giving you the verses. This is, again, kind of an overview thing. But in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, God comes to Abram. His name is Abram at this time. And he says, listen, man, I want you. And he calls him out of his people and says, I want you to go to a land that I'm going to give you. I'm going to bless your name. And he was 75 years old when this took place, verse 4 tells us. And he leaves and he sets out for Haran. And he takes Lot with him. And we're going to, if you've read some of Genesis and the Abraham story, Abraham and Lot get into some interesting circumstances. But the call of Abraham is given at this point, and God, it's more than just a call and come and be, my follower, come and worship me as God, calling him out of the gods of his father, which, he's called out of pagan, kind of a pagan family, obviously. And it's just more than just his personal story. God is saying, I want to use you as a significant piece for the redemption of mankind. This is, again, the epic saga of God redeeming mankind to himself, and Abraham's going to play a huge role in that. And so we pick it up in Genesis, again, chapter 12, but then you move into Genesis chapter 15, and this is where he makes one of this, huge covenant. There's this whole covenant chapter. In fact, above, chapter 15 in my translation, it says God's covenant with Abram. And he makes this covenant with him, saying that out of your own body, I'm going to give you an heir. And he says down in verse 7, he said, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur, of the land of the Chaldeans, to give you this land, that you may take possession of it. And so he does this. And if you've been to church, I'm assuming you've heard this story before. He gets, I think it's 3 animals and cuts them in half. Yeah. He gets like birds, didn't get cut in half, but he gets these animals and a heifer, a goat, and a ram, and he cuts them in half and lays them. And there's this whole covenant that's made, this agreement that's made. It was very well known in his day and age. But the whole story is God takes all the risk, and this is so significant because the, choosing of Abram and then, making a covenant with him. This is so significant to God. Hear this. This is so significant to God that God's going to take all the risk. He's going to, if Abraham's unfaithful, fine, God's going to pay the price, because at the end of the day, God is going to redeem a world. God's going to redeem mankind. And Abraham it's wonderful. He loves God. He responds. He's going to walk before God. He's going to trust God. He's going to have some blunders, but he's going to walk, he loves God. But even in the midst of Abraham's kind of pseudo faithfulness, God is not entrusting the redemption of a world, with Abraham. He's not putting it into Abraham's hands. He's keeping it close to his chest. God himself is going to do what God needs to do in order to redeem mankind. That's the whole Abraham story. In fact, what's really significant, and I just think this is important, when you read through an Old Testament, you constantly have to there's this overarching narrative, biblical narrative, that everything God is doing, all the details in every scene with every main character, all the way from Abraham to David, and up into the New Testament to Jesus. The whole theme is God redeeming mankind to himself. This is what God is after. This is nothing's by chance. It's not just, killing time. It's not just kind of seeing how things play out. God himself is wanting to redeem mankind. And so that you really pick this up strong in chapter 15 of Genesis. And I encourage you to go through this chapter. I'm not going to read all the details, but again, the whole deal is I'm going to make a covenant with you, and I want to bless you. I want to use you in this epic saga narrative to redeem mankind. I'm going to bring a son through your body, and it's going to be great. You're going to have descendants. The whole world's going to be affected by this covenant that I make with you. But at the end of the day, I have an agenda, is what God is saying. And so that's really significant. And we get this here in Genesis chapter 15, of course. And then you move into Genesis chapter 16. And we're moving quickly, but this is where you have one of the blunders, probably stronger than a blunder, but you get this blunder by Abraham. And Sarah comes to him in chapter 16, verse 1, and she's like, listen, verse 2, in fact, I quote, the Lord has kept me from having children. So, hey, I've got Hagar, my maidservant, and I want you to produce an heir through her. And so verse 4, he sleeps with Hagar and she conceives, and she will give birth to Ishmael. Now, Ishmael is Abraham's firstborn son, but he's not the son of promise, who's Isaac, he'll come around in chapter 18. And so you have Ishmael, again, firstborn son, and Ishmael is the line where we get Islam, where we get Muslims from. And so, when you look over in the Middle East and you see this major, obviously friction and animosity, to say it lightly, between, Muslims and Jews, and even Muslims, Jews, and Christians, but primarily just Muslims and Jews, it's Ishmael and Isaac. I mean, although Ishmael is the firstborn, and that's kind of the angle that, Muslims are coming at, looking at Abraham, coming at their ancestor. He's the firstborn, but Isaac is the son of promise. He's the son of faith. He's the one that was miraculously conceived, and you can get his story beginning in chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. And then there's some, at chapter 21, verses 1 through 3, there's some more in there with all of that. But, that's the two main players. So you have Islam, and then you have, are Muslims, and then you have Jews, which is, with Abraham, or with Isaac, and so Isaac and Ishmael, and so they both come. Now they both come from Abraham. So those two significant nations are in play even today, which is why we want to look at this, because the end time setting has those two people groups, along with another one, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But those two people groups are at the heart of all end times eschatology. They both play a major role. Now, you go a little bit further down into Genesis chapter 25, and of course, Abraham dies just a little bit before this. I think it's in the same chapter, actually. Chapter 25, the beginning. Abraham dies. And then you have Isaac, his son, gets married, and his wife has two kids. And, he comes, and it's interesting. He comes to Rebecca, and she was barren, but the Lord answers her prayer, and she becomes, pregnant. And verse 22 of chapter 25 reads like this: the babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. And what's significant about Jacob and Esau, and again, it's this weird kind of birth order thing because Esau comes out first, but Jacob is the one who ends up receiving the blessing. You can go back and read that and the whole deception with mom and dad, and Esau's the hunter, and Jacob kind of hangs around the tents with mom, and she kind of sides with Jacob, and dad kind of is partial to Esau, and he ends up getting first the birthright, then he gets the blessing. And so Esau wants to kill Jacob. And there's a whole story that you should familiarize yourself, with in understanding all of this. But what's essential for us, what I really just wanted to cover quickly in this video is that Abraham, who is the son of promise that God's going to, utilize, he's going to bring into covenant to redeem an entire world. Out of Abraham comes Isaac and Ishmael. So you have Muslims and Jews. And then out of the son of promise, which is Isaac, you're going to have Jacob and Esau. And Esau is where you get the Palestinians. And then, of course, Jacob is where you have the 12 tribes of Israel, which will be produced through, actually, I think 4 women. And he ends up moving into the promised land. And you have all the 12 sons 12 tribes of Israel, 12 sons that will flourish and actually take claim and actually have some investment in the land that is promised. But these 3 people groups that are present on the news, and have been since Israel became a nation. You have the Palestinians, you have the Muslims, and then you have the Jews. And if you want to throw Christians in there, but Christians and Jews both come back to Abraham. You have those people groups, which the conflict, the nations, the rub, the end times significance, and all of that is explained. All of that is explained as you go through the book of Genesis. God is saying, what I am establishing here and what I'm, with this covenant that I'm bringing, dude, it's got far reaching from that time on. I mean, what is that? 4,500 years of, in the future to our day and age. God's saying with the implications of what he's doing at that time period through Abraham, he said, this is going to have, implications to the very end. So what I'm getting at is when we're looking at eschatology, you really have to go back and start, and looking at this narrative of God reaching out and really not just picking individuals, but really setting the stage thousands of years before, our day, which I just believe strongly we're just in the season of the last days. And we'll get to that here in several videos. But, the nations that are strategically placed in land and boundaries and what got all of that was determined thousands of years ago, back in Genesis chapter 15. And so, here in chapter 25, Jacob and Esau are born, and Jacob will eventually, just to give it to you down in chapter 32, you see the 12 tribes, his 12 sons, which will become the 12 tribes, will be mentioned in Genesis chapter 35. But in chapter 32, he wrestles with God. He leaves Laban and he's headed back to meet with his brother Esau. And, he sends all of his family over the river and he kind of stays behind, wrestles with God. His name is changed to Israel. And so you have the birth of Israel, which of course, Jesus is the king of that group, of that people. And they will be the ones that will be, enter into the promised land, and which we're going to look at in the next video, but they're going to enter into the promised land, and they're going to be stewards of the land. And most of the time, unfortunately, they're going to be poor stewards of the land. But the land of promise that God promised Abraham, which of course will be picked up by Jesus, the people of Israel are to steward that land. The land of Israel does not belong to Israel. The land of Israel belongs to the Messiah, which is Jesus, and Israel is to steward that land. And so it comes from the covenant that God made with Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, and then the 12 tribes who are going to steward that land. And for a season, God's going to use them to produce a Messiah that's going to redeem a world. That's the statement. That's why Abraham is so significant. He's the father of many nations. Like he's the He's the big deal. And, back in the book of Genesis, prophetically speaking. And so I just wanted to spend maybe 20 minutes and just kind of familiarize you with Abraham. And we're going to get a little bit more technical in some of the videos in as we move along. But a lot of this is going to be pointing you in the right direction. Like, this is kind of what we're looking at, and you're going to have to go through and read it. But the significance of the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then mentioning obviously, Ishmael and Esau. Ishmael, Muslims; Esau, Palestinians, and then of course, that whole relationship between those. That's really significant. It has end time significance. It begins with Abraham, and his descendants are not just going to be, people, but people groups that are going to play significant role, even in our day and time. And so, I think when you, and I mentioned this in the first video, when you listen to people talk about eschatology, I just think it's really important that you start way back before the action begins, so to speak. People want to go to Revelation and Daniel and look at some of the things Jesus says. Well, there's this entire backdrop of significant events that have, built up to this point. Like, why is everybody fighting over the land of Israel? Well, they all claim to have they all fight because they have claim to it, so to speak. I mean, Ishmael can go back and say, Abraham was my dad, and Esau can do the same thing. Hey, Abraham was my grandpa, so, these people groups that are going on in the Middle East, they have history to them. So that's one of the reasons you have the rub, and strictly outside of a, Judeo-Christian kind of perspective on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, these other people groups, mainly again, Muslims and Palestinians, they look back and say, we've got rights to the land. So that's what's going on and over there, and the fighting and all that's taking place. It has significance that rests all the way back in Abraham. So I wanted to cover that. And next video is going to be a little bit more technical. We're going to look into some of the timing, because God not only, and you're going to pick this up, and we're not going to spend much time in the law. I mean, we're going to glance over it, but there's, the law was separating a people unto God. Like, you're for my purpose. That's like the big deal for the law. The law was not given, to produce righteousness. That comes through faith. That comes through trusting God. That was Abraham's deal. But the law was given as to separate a people for himself. That was an old covenant kind of process among the nations. God's like, Israel, you're mine. And he separates, them to himself. And it's within the law. It's more than just a bunch of rules. There's time. There's like timing, the calendar, like all the significant prophetic time kind of approach to how they're going to live their lives. Like, and we're going to get to this in the next video, but, just to give you a little bit of teaser, separating Israel to himself, they were not to live like the nations lived in just, independence from God. Every single aspect, this is so good, you're going to love it. Every single aspect of Israel, from their diet to their laws, to their, how they fought wars, how they received wives and husbands and all of that, even to the very, the months of the year, God was setting them on a prophetic timetable. And you say, what do you mean by prophetic timetable? It was a timetable to bring about a redeemer into the world. Like, that was Israel. They were this chosen instrument, and every minute aspect of their existence was on God's timetable. It was on God's agenda. There was one purpose for Israel, and it was to bring about a Messiah. So we're going to look at some of that with the timing and the dates and the calendars and the festivals and some of the law stuff in the next video, which again is super significant, and there's no way we could possibly cover it all in one video. So I'm just going to give you some structure so you can study it yourself. I hope that was good. I hope it's helpful. I hope you enjoy it. All right. See you next time.